Welcome everyone to tonight's session of the Digital Cultures Festival. My name is Anna Despont, and I'm one of the curators of the festival. I have the tremendous pleasure to welcome you in the studio together with Jan Zygmuntowski, and who will be joined by Brett Gaylor later tonight. The festival is running from the 17th of October till the 25th of October, and it's an opportunity for all of us to look at imagined futures. I would like to encourage everyone who's watching us to participate in the ciné-club evening, and if you would like to join us, you have the opportunity to ask questions on most of the platforms, YouTube, Facebook, but also on Zoom. For those of you who are registered at our website, Digital Cultures PL, you can click the Join button, and then you will be redirected to a Zoom webinar where you will be able to get more content. I will be pasting some links, so this is why I have a computer here, and I will be sitting here and pasting some links for you so that you can retrace whatever we're talking about. And also, if you would like to join us in the discussion at the end of the evening, I would totally recommend to you to raise your hand. We can also have you live here from the studio. So I'm really hoping that we can recreate in this digital environment a feeling of togetherness and of being together for this event to speak with our guests, but also to maybe ask some questions and to have a constructive discussion, I hope, about our imagined futures. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jan Zygmuntowski, who will be hosting you tonight. Hi, Jan.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Jan is an economist studying the fields of development, economic system, innovation, theory, and digital economy.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction, and I'm super glad to be here. Now being already introduced, I will now introduce our today's guest, who is Brett Gaylor, already with us connected. Brett is part technologist, that especially on the side of him being for 10 years a part of Mozilla Foundation's senior management, but also he's a movie maker and a awarded one. A lot of documentaries here and a lot of prizes won here on the web, on the remix culture, and finally on the data economy and surveillance capitalism. Brett, hi, and I'm giving the stage for your presentation.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Anna. I will switch over from Chrome to Firefox so I can do my presentation. And I'm very pleased to be here and super impressed by the studio. I had no idea. Anna, thank you so much for having me. And I wish I could be there in Warsaw. I loved the city last time I was there. I right now am in Victoria, British Columbia. And I want to acknowledge that is the traditional lands, the unceded lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. So I hope I'm presenting my slides right now. And I want to talk about the internet. I make movies about the internet. As Jan said, the first one I made was RIP, a Remix Manifesto in 2008. And the most recent one I'm really excited to share with you all, The Internet of Everything, which is a web series and a feature film. We're going to show a couple of episodes of the web series today, and the film is available online as well. They're documentaries, creative nonfiction with real people, and they're made for sort of broad audiences. So the concepts and research that might be familiar to me and many of you at this conference are largely not familiar with that audience. And so I'd like to start today by showing the first episode of The Internet of Everything. It's really weird to be watching that movie playing in Poland while watching myself and my daughter, who's literally upstairs right now. And that's also really exciting and wonderful that we can do that. I wanted to sort of frame today's talk about narratives, and the format and subject of this year's conference is really exciting to me, because I think a lot about the narratives we're creating about the internet. And aside from my filmmaking work, I've worked with organizations that are hoping that particular types of narratives about the internet win. So it's an exercise in changing minds, essentially. At Mozilla, I was a program officer for something called the Creative Media Awards, which grew out of a partnership with the Open Society Foundation called Surveillance Counter Narratives. So we wanted to push an alternative to the narrative that surveillance was making society safer. And this grew into a program that creates media critiquing AI systems. And that program is still running at Mozilla. And here are a few of my favorite projects to come out of that program. There was an interactive documentary called Stealing Your Feelings. We made a deepfake about Richard Nixon. Pardon me, the grantees made a deepfake about Richard Nixon. Adi Wegenecht did makeup tutorials that gave information about security, information security. Chupadados, which looks at the surveillance of women's bodies in Latin America. And there was a fake dating app called Monster Mash that reveals how bias works in AI. And these are all bits of media that are intended to change the story that people have inside their heads about AI. And there's a whole universe of people making content about the internet and AI and the digital society and the whole mess of it. And most of it is critical. So I'm immersed in that mess, and I think about narratives a lot. So my COVID project this summer was a video series with Harmony Labs, which is a research lab in New York. And what we wanted to do was create sort of a framework for how to spot and then eventually measure cultural narratives, because we want certain narratives to win. So I want to show this because it gives us a framework today for how we can define narratives about the internet. So you can please show the presentation video one. Thanks. So the first narrative that I was kind of involved in, let's say, trying to shape or push, was this one, free culture. And when I made RIP, the narrative that I and the folks I was making the film with wanted to seed was that internet culture was actually a return to the natural order of things, of culture, where culture was created by many people and not just a few. And this was made around the early 2000s. And my influences were very white and nerdy, just like Weird Al. The film came out at a time when the record industry was really at its peak and then was suddenly disrupted by file sharing services like Napster. The music industry, represented here by Lars Ulrich of Metallica, began suing people who used the internet to experience music. Lawrence Lessig, seen here thinking, was concerned that this approach was criminalizing young people who weren't just stealing music, they were experiencing it differently by remixing it on their home computers and making new things. Everyone now had the ability to become a culture jammer. And the person that I met who most personified this was named Greg Gillis, seen on the left at his day job as a biomedical engineer, and on the right as his alter ego, Girl Talk. He was making really fun mashup music by combining bits of songs he was downloading online and then recombining them on his computer. His live shows were really amazing because there was no boundary between him and the audience. And at first, he was playing in art galleries and laundromats, but then eventually real shows. And while we were making the film, he became quite a phenomenon, playing these huge clubs and eventually music festivals. His rapid popularity felt like the internet felt at that time. Things were really changing, there were no rules, and the old people were really annoyed. And while I was filming with Girl Talk, we decided that we wanted to make the film open source. And what that meant was that I was going to share footage and invite others to collaborate in making it. And I think that is what made the film ultimately special, was that it was made by many hands. There were posters of the film made by viewers, there was translations into dozens of languages, whole scenes and animations were contributed to the film, and then it was leaked on the Pirate Bay before it was broadcast. And so it was seen by a lot of people, and it was influenced. And I became very inspired by changes in Brazil at that moment. Lula had made remix an essential part of cultural policy. Gilberto Gil became the Minister of Culture, which was extra significant because his music, Tropicalia, had been influenced itself by a modern art movement of the 1920s called anthropophagia, which celebrated Latin America's mixture of cultures and influences. And this was really a different set of influences than the ones that I had when I set off making the film. And it was much broader and more interesting than me. And as the film was released, we kept changing it. And people who watched it found solidarity with the people who the music industry was suing, and were particularly outraged when a woman named Jamie Thomas had $250,000 of charges levied against her by the recording industry for downloading a dozen classic rock songs. So it's crazy to think about that now because it's basically the equivalent of sharing a Spotify playlist. But at that time, there was no legal way to actually consume music online. And the film had a manifesto, which essentially said that the utopic vision of the future could only occur if we limited the influence of the dinosaurs of the past. And there's a lot in hindsight that was naive about the film, but it resonated with people because it was fun, it was inclusive of different cultures, and it was about a collective vision for the future. It was participatory and it was active. We wanted it to feel like by watching it, you were somehow making the future. So if we go by the narrative analysis of the video we just showed, what the character of the film was the copyleft, those who proposed a new vision for intellectual property. But I wanted the character to also be you, the viewer, and that's why the narration was explicitly written that way. The unhappy ending we imagined was culture as a shopping mall, that corporations would wall off the internet so that culture was something that other people did, and you just paid for. The happy ending we imagined was that the production of culture was democratized and that we could see a joyful call and response happening in culture thanks to the internet. So the emotion that we wanted you to feel was joy. And I would say that that's the future we live in now. These are my two favorite internet memes of this 2020 pandemic. That's a guy named Dogface on the left, singing to Fleetwood Mac, which launched this TikTok challenge that Mick Fleetwood actually took part in himself. And of course, on the right, that's Sarah Cooper remixing the face of Donald Trump, which I think is better than anything Saturday Night Live has done in years. And over the past couple of years, I and many people have done a lot of soul searching about those early days. And from today's perspective, it's easy to say that we were incredibly naive to believe so strongly that the internet was positive. But I think it's also important to recognize that the future we wanted and that many people were activists for and build platforms for, an aspect of that universe did come to pass. And that was a result of a certain utopic thinking. There was a vision for the future, a manifesto that people wanted to call their own. Nevertheless, folks began recognizing that the business model that underwrote the internet, advertising, was also destroying it. In 2014, Ethan Zuckerman called it the internet's original sin, that Garden of Eden imagined in the free culture days had become poisoned by this model that required information about us to work, which led to advertisers and platforms racing to gobble up information about us. And as we saw with Snowden, this information could be gathered by the US government. And that was creepy, but it was hard. It was a hard problem to get people to care about. Most people find advertising annoying, so they ignore it. They don't see themselves as spies, so they don't see why the US government would want to spy on them. However, the major platforms clearly had a narrative that privacy was anachronistic, and they were pushing this. They thought of privacy as just as old school as we had thought the music industry was previously. Mark Zuckerberg said on stage that privacy was no longer a social norm. And Eric Schmidt said in an interview that if you have something you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. So in other words, if you haven't done anything wrong, you've got nothing to hide. So at this time, I dedicated myself to spreading a different narrative, that privacy is important. And to do that, I made an interactive documentary series called Do Not Track. And this series attempted to do two things: show people how their information was collected online by actually collecting data about them, and then talking to people about why this mattered. Human rights activists, InfoSec practitioners, journalists, and sociologists. We really made it about the specific user that was interacting with the series, We used their specific data, and we created an API that collected and built visualizations and experiences with their data. And the whole purpose of the project was to get people to care about privacy. It was well received, but this is sort of the general sense of that coverage. Vice said it creeps you out. Fast Company said it shows you just how little online privacy you have. The New York Times called it a cautionary tale. So it scared people. And I suppose that is what I wanted. But I think that those of us in this digital rights space and people advocating for the people to care about the direction the internet is going, with a few exceptions, have been kind of stuck in this mode. And if I think of the narrative framework for Do Not Track, the character was you again, but the ending depended on your actions during the series and your responses to surveys. Depending on how we had profiled you, you would see a speculative future written by French futurists Lepac. Big Brother was an authoritarian surveillance state. Big Business was where GAFA grew even bigger, or Big Win, which was the happy ending to the narrative. And the happy ending we imagined predicted an international council that would set privacy limits and would adjudicate what and how the internet was used, sort of like a Paris Accord for privacy. Well, you know what they say about predicting the future, right? Our series came out in 2015, and the following year we had Cambridge Analytica, Russian election interference in the US, Facebook social engineering, Trump got elected, then we had Brexit, QAnon, Pizzagate. It's been a mess on the internet, and that's just the shit I know about in the English-speaking world. And I would argue that mostly what we've been doing as media makers, trying to change that direction is basically scaring people more. Many of you probably saw The Social Dilemma or The Great Hack. These were two huge films seen by tens of millions of people, both on Netflix. And The Social Dilemma has been in their top 10 for weeks. And I'm not here to dunk on these films. I actually liked The Social Dilemma, even though I agree with a lot of the critiques of it, which you can find on Twitter if you want. But I liked it because it's useful. It restated this narrative. If you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. So for anyone who hasn't heard that before, if they exist, now they know. But the film introduced Shoshana Zuboff's mind bomb idea to a much larger audience. The idea of markets and human futures. And this frames the modern internet as a tool for manipulating our behavior. Most people aren't going to read her book, so this alone makes the film incredibly important. The dilemma predicted here isn't about privacy, it's about changing our behavior so that we're completely captured by a capitalist worldview. And that is a total bummer of an idea. And the film is incredibly dark. Just like with my project, Do Not Track, people perceive it as a horror story. And they've really raised the stakes with the project, basically saying that Silicon Valley has become evil and that the unhappy ending is the destruction of society. In the trailer, they call it Checkmate on Civilization, where we'll devolve into feuding factions and not rise to the challenge of climate change, literally destroying the world. And that is a depressing future. And I think the point has been made. We do not need to continue to scare people. Check. Academics, activists, filmmakers, you can stand by and stand down. Everyone is freaked the fuck out. And you need to be careful about freaking people out if you want to move them towards positive narratives. So I'm going to play you another video from the series I made this summer about narratives. And this one examines narratives around artificial intelligence. And we actually measured people's reactions to some of the work that was created. So if you could please play presentation video 2. So I don't want to scare people anymore. Aside from being counterproductive, as that video is meant to show, it's just not that relevant anymore, especially after this horrible year. In the digital rights space, we need to imagine and show and discuss what our dreams for the internet actually are. But it's really hard to imagine life outside of these digital cages. If you haven't read Speculative Everything by Fiona Raby and Anthony Dunn, I highly recommend it. They're designers who built artifacts from the future. And here's what they say about dreaming and culture today. It's hard to say what today's dreams are. It seems they have been downgraded to hopes. Hopes that we will not allow ourselves to become extinct, hope that we can feed the starving, hope that there will be room for us all on the planet. There are no more visions. We don't know how to fix the planet and ensure our survival. We're just hopeful. And it feels like the future that we've been imagining as activists for the internet, of a legal framework that will enshrine privacy, that feels more like a hope than a dream. So I made the Internet of Everything during a time where I was between wanting to sound the alarm about the internet, but also wanting to leave space for some of that dreaming. And with the film and the web series, I did find some dreamers and some people that were pretty scared too. We saw people making recyclable clothes in Barcelona, citizen open data movements in Toronto, police abolitionists in LA. I wanted to make the film and series about this choice. I still tell the audience some things that are concerning, as you'll see in the clip we're about to show, but ultimately I'm interested in telling stories about the internet that are joyful, participatory, inclusive, and constructive. And we need many of these stories so that they can form into these broad narratives that can push culture and the world to the future we want. And as we work together on this, I wanted to leave a thought from the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson. I'm reading his book that came out just last week, The Ministry for the Future, right now, and it's totally amazing. He said, think of your postulated futures as hopes and fears, typically with your hopes being utopian and your fears dystopian. Go ahead and imagine a lot of them and see how you feel about them and what you think is realistic in them. Give up on wanting to be pure. Stop believing in purity and adjure the righteousness of that feeling, which is so quickly becomes righteous indignation. In politics, the front of good work is broad. So pick your special point of interest, but accept others have other points of special interest and work in solidarity with them, rather than arguing about which point has priority. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for the presentation and the clips, Brett. Now, before we go deeper into talks about narratives, it's definitely a great topic for discussion and we should continue it. First, let's just watch together the third episode of the Internet of Everything, which points at today's reality of data ownership and governance. And in the film, it's depicted specifically on the case of fitness data. Could we have the episode?
Hi, thanks for this film. So the film was very much about the world we're living in and about also the things that we discussed, remix and reuse. Actually, they interfered with our reality. And the big companies interfered. And on one of the platforms that where we are streaming tonight's talk, the stream has been interrupted due to copyright infringements. So what we need to do now is that to have everyone, all the people from all the platforms, to have them able to come back to us. We will now stop the stream, and there will be a new stream coming up in the moment. So please stay with us because we have to reset this. And we'll be back in a second. If you're using Zoom webinar, you will have to refresh it. If you're on Facebook, the stream will also come back as a new stream. But we've been just banned due to copyright infringements. So we'll be back. We'll be back in a second. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, and thanks for your patience. So yes, algorithms are stronger than us, and although there were no copyright infringements, I guess we had to restart the video. But now we're back in the studio, and Jan and Brett.
Let's have a fireside chat, but also please remember I'm constantly looking at my tablet. There's Q&A coming from you, from the audience. So if on any of the platforms you wish to ask questions, I will be glad to pass them on. The first one, though, comes from me. Brett, let's discuss these different approaches that people take when faced with the reality of corporate surveillance that's around us. In the movie, we see that there's a couple of those approaches, and some of them show that some people find some comfort in the situation, even though it is clearly troubling. And I think the case of Sarah is the most interesting, where she jokes about Google knowing her period, but at the same time, she keeps on using the new tools. And the question is it like the unsettled people are a minority? And even if so, is that a bad thing?
Sorry, Anna, is the question is like, are people in the minority that accept it?
Is it that the people who are unsettled, who criticize this, are we, if I may say we, are we the minority?
Yeah.
Is it a bad thing we're a minority? Do those, different attitudes change over time?
No, I think that no, I don't think that we are that. Okay, so I'm still wearing my Fitbit, but the folks who might be troubled by information being collected about them, I think that they are actually probably the majority, and there's lots of studies that have come out that suggest this, at least in the United States, that most people have this sense of the surveillance, but the trouble is that they're not sure what to do with that information. There's a sort of a lack of a vocabulary around that. Most times when you talk to people about it, they might say, "Oh, it's creepy," and I think that that's again why. I thought that actually the social dilemma was progress, because rather than just talking about this in terms of privacy, and there's many other folks who are doing this, we're getting a little bit more sophistication when we talk about the dilemmas of the digital society. And so in the first episode of the Internet of Everything, as you can see, I'm a parent. And so my peer group, most of the time, what people talk about is just screen time, like how much time you're using it. And there's a lot of anxiety about that. So I wanted to try to introduce sort of different, ways in which that the digital society interacts with other parts of our life. So no, the answer is I think most people understand that something's going wrong, and that's part of our job, I think, as sort of cultural agitators, is to sort of help flesh out that language.
So you mentioned that during the making of Internet of Everything, you also stumbled upon people who are creating some alternatives and some other, maybe not other narratives, but they're building some kind of other tech, other cultures. Do you think they are the protagonists of some kind of the new narrative, the new movie, or are they just creating a base for something new to emerge?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's certainly, I one of the examples in the future is the sort of Fab Lab movement that many people might be familiar with, but I think that most people are not. So this idea that the internet could actually be something that enables decentralized manufacturing, that's not typically something that people associate with the internet, or even the Internet of Things, right? I was in the film we were talking about, people mostly associate that with, Google Home or Alexa, things like that, and instead wanted to think about, hey, the Internet of Things could enable a lot more than that. And so I think that, yeah, there is emerging narratives that maybe the protagonist of those are these sort of new makers who are trying to sort of reclaim the purpose and spirit of the internet. So yeah, I think that they would be protagonists. I'm always falling back into this pattern of thinking about the protagonist as the user of the internet, because it's something that you use. And maybe I need to break out of that. But that's sort of I'm always imagining that as the protagonist is that end user. Like, what would it be like for you to be able to participate in a culture where you were making things that you needed, for instance?
So in some sense, you mean hijacking. So you said that the IoT as a term is hijacked by some people. So it's not even about creating like completely new words, completely new ideas, but more like taking the ones that were promised, are a failed promise, and then like trying to fulfill them, to realize them in the full potential. Is that it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I was really inspired by a lot of the. I saw the panel this morning that had Anna, Jane, and the Superflex folks, and that was actually a really important touchstone for me. Was that a colleague of mine at Mozilla, Michelle Thorne, had commissioned them to create this IoT object from the future that was really, useful and sort of at the service of the people that were using it. And so it got me to thinking, like, what would the conditions need to exist for that object to come into being? And yeah, they used some of those tropes of the home assistant, but then sort of looked at them with a slightly different angle. And I always find that's quite useful. Particularly as I said in the presentation, we like the web series was for like Arte and the CBC's like broad audience. So it's helpful to anchor people in something that they're familiar with in their everyday life, and then sort of expand that circle outwards. I find that useful.
It's really interesting for me being from a different generation from you. So I never experienced the Californian ideology and their entire promise of the internet. I was growing up. I was a small kid when it happened. So for me, the remix culture was something already slowly dying out when I was more aware of things, of the digital economy. And so it's interesting that we can use, as you mentioned, the terms that people are aware of and say like, hey, in terms of, for example, innovation, like, do you really believe a new feature in your app is innovation, where what is promised to you is AI, basically, which can, I don't know, heal cancer, right? So so we're actually taking the same promise that was given, but then saying they actually failed us. But you need to say that they failed us, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and maybe it's also about rethinking some of the ways that we think about, past and future. I thought Ingrid Lafleur and the concept of, different, different approaches to futures and different cultures, which don't necessarily have that same binary, would allows you to be able to do that that pattern recognition. To say like, oh, this is similar to that. And that's indeed actually with the Internet of Everything, one of the sort of explicit goals of the project. We did this with Do Not Track as well, as sort of write down like, what do you want the mission of this to be? And it was to have folks to recognize the trade-offs in the Internet of Things before it was too late. So sort of implicit in that is that there's some kind of like choice that you're making. There's something about time, before it's too late, but also we wanted people to be able to do pattern matching. So I worked with some fun folks about that. Actually, the Twitter account, the Internet of Shit, the person behind that came to a workshop that I did with the Incredible Machine, which are some Dutch Internet of Things creators. And the goal of that workshop that we did together was to be able to sort of break down these dilemmas into patterns that you would be able to see in objects. And so, yeah, to your point, it's like sometimes that's not an innovation. This is not neither an innovation nor a new problematic. It's like maybe we've seen that somewhere else. So for instance, like IoT objects that sort of will brick if you no longer have access to them, if you're no longer paying. So that's sort of something about denying you control over your own home and your own or potentially your own body or your own belongings, and sort of disassociating that from the specific thing that maybe this tech company does that may not exist in 5 years or maybe acquired. Being able to spot the pattern, I think, is important for people.
I'm going to ask you the first question from the audience, which I think has a very recent turn. Looking at that, we are speaking online because of COVID. I think this question is informed by this. It is a question of the possibility, or how would you maybe do this, to use the narrative tools that are used to now disintegrate the public space, hijack it, and disrupt our public space, to actually install scientific peer-reviewed knowledge. I guess this is about kind of fake news, but also, all this anti-COVID, the QAnon that you mentioned. How do we counter it?
If that person has some ideas, I would love to hear them, because I think that it is that is one challenge of being so reliant on the internet right now. So when the film The Internet of Everything came out, it was like March 18th or 23rd or something. It was like right when Canada went into lockdown, and it was interesting because the way that the film was perceived here in Canada was that like, oh my goodness, we've been thinking about the internet as this, dark thing for so long. Maybe we also have to recognize that it has the potential to sort of unite us and bring us together and provide so many resources like education or even, health information that we weren't able to have before. And so, but at the same time, with so much time on our screens, that leads us to the same dilemmas of like, tribalism or only trusting information from friends, which might not be right. But I don't know. I feel like ultimately that might not be like that. That's a function of the culture you're living in. So I don't know if that is that happening in Poland. Here in Canada, we right now I think most people are trusting public health authorities. Although just the other day, I literally had a physical, like somebody was yelling at me for wearing a mask here in sleepy little Victoria. Is it happening? But like, what's the context in Poland? Are people trusting information?
Well, people are trusting information because for now the information seemed bad, and that's what everybody expected at this point.
Yeah.
And also there's a lot of information streamed directly, on the platforms. So for a moment, the platforms are not about ads. They are about really human interaction.
Right.
And I feel at times like this, we as humans, our society can kind of counteract the surveillance mechanisms just because we talk so much, we engage so much that we can outmaneuver the algorithms. But
I mean, I do think, so, and I didn't really answer that too. Yeah, I do think that's an area where, policy is really important, to be able to, the platforms have some possibility, and it feels like a place where they can make an outsized impact about things like fact checking. And so that is starting to happen, and it's a place where advocacy seems to be effective.
Can we take the policy turn for a second? I find it really interesting because one of the questions here is a question which is very broad, so I will try to boil it down. It's a question of, is there a way out of surveillance capitalism? But more specifically, do we need some kind of makeover of the internet, of the entire architecture, how the web is built? Do we need to build a new, maybe public, shared, common architecture? Do we need to just regulate whatever is, but then like strictly regulate? How do you see that? Do you think that the platforms built as they are now, can they be counteracted just with the 2014 slogan of get rid of ads and this is enough?
Well, I mean, I think that is a particular thing. Being able to find different business models for the internet, that's an urgent piece of work that a lot of people are doing. But I think this is one of those examples where, and I hope this is not too cliche, but where, when you're thinking about these alternatives, it's often more, it's like, it's about the verb and not the noun, you know what I mean? I think we have to continually be trying to poke at the internet and tweak the parts of it that seem problematic, because we don't know what possibilities that will open up. Just in the same way that nobody could have predicted that, pop-up ads would have sort of led to the surveillance capitalism ecosystem that we have now. I think, tweaking and trying different models and continually trying different things will create futures that we can't imagine now. So that aspect of thinking about the future as work that we have to do, rather than trying to get that specific perfect solution. And that's sort of that Kim Stanley Robinson quote that I mentioned, I think is part of that. It's like, I think that the folks who are working on, cryptocurrency micropayments, that may be one example, or the folks who are kind of coming at it from a policy angle to like regulate advertising in specific ways. That may be an example, or folks like us that are at this conference thinking about cultural production. That is also an important part of the equation. So I think it's like that was one other thing about making this project, was that I did this interview with Nellie Bowles, who's a reporter for the New York Times, and she was like, "You're coming at this all wrong when you're thinking about the internet as this specific technology. It's just like part of everything now, just like electricity or oxygen." So, thinking about internet policy might not be the right thing. Maybe it's actually about thinking about human rights policy, or policies that will interact with the internet.
Right, that's a very cool answer. I have this question was now expanded here, so I can ask you even more specifically. That the question is about, for example, what is your take on Mastodon as an idea? If you know Mastodon as a another way of doing social media, versus, for example, data justice projects. So I guess that your answer is that in general we need to push these different directions, and somehow over time we will see which worked, which didn't, and for now we should just support everyone, everyone who seems to try something new. The question is, what if the new thing is actually a corporate agenda packed in some kind of nice Californian ideology once again? The entire AI ethics discussion, which is mostly fueled by Google, Facebook, Amazon's money. The entire I reckon that there was a lot of funding going to competition policy and to this the competition institute at one of US universities. So the folks talking about regulation, competition regulation, were actually funded by the biggest monopolies. How do we discern between true and false futures?
Yeah, a lot of the work around net neutrality, for instance, was also funded by Google and groups like Fight for the Future in their early days. That those were brought into being by a lot of companies that at that time in the early internet fight were the sort of underdogs, and then now have become the sort of hegemony. It's a difficult one. I do believe in that idea that Cory Doctorow has talked about, of finding social issues with business models, which sounds awful when you say it, but it's like you do need to find points of pressure that are able to sort of cause harm to capitalists. Like they want to be able to solve that problem, or that it causes them a problem. I think that's important. As I do also think that we have to recognize, like, meet people where they're at. So if we say something like a Mastodon, what is your goal on that social network? Is it to reach a lot of people, or is it to sort of find affinity? I think you have to sort of look at those trade-offs. So if you want to insert a narrative that many people will see, at this point it might not be the social network for that, and maybe that needs to be okay. Maybe it needs to be a social network of a different purpose, and maybe that sort of attention economy paradigm of the current social networks is problematic as well. But just completely abandoning Twitter or those kinds of networks to be able to influence massive amounts of people isn't going to work either. So I think it's really about picking and choosing, which I don't know, is that a cop-out? Anna, did I just cop out?
No, absolutely. Can I ask you and follow on this, because you just mentioned like logging off, going off platforms. There's a question coming from Teresia, a question about the possibility of living a modern life, however you understand it, without being tracked at all.
Right. No.
What would be the trade-off for this? Like, do you think it is even possible?
Probably not. There's some really. Go ahead, Anna. I thought you were.
Anna, you were
Sorry, no,
saying something.
I think we are out of sync a bit, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
There's some really great reporting by Kashmir Hill, looking at trying to spend, like, I think, is it a week or a year without Amazon? I don't remember. But it is true that they are incredibly deeply embedded in our life. So it's very hard, even just to use the internet, without being tracked, obviously, because so much of the infrastructure is owned by those big companies. So no, I don't think it is necessarily possible. And I wonder too, though, so again, what is it about that bothers you and that you want to prevent? I think that's the more interesting question, because when I made Do Not Track, that was the sort of dilemma that we were running up against, is like, why does this matter? Is like privacy as a concept, like, why specifically does that matter, and in which contexts? So there are sort of the human rights approach is that you can't be authentic and yourself when people are watching, in the same way that we put locks on our bedrooms. And so I think it's probably impossible to lead a life that some parts of your data are not viewable by others, but it is possible to lead a life where the things that are important to you are safeguarded. And so that's when you need to think about choosing the platforms you use, or deciding to use encrypted communications for specific types of discussions that you're having. That's incredibly important in an activist or journalistic context. So I think it has to be context specific. But I can imagine a future that is a positive one, where yes, there is information and we're leaving our traces, but it's not necessarily being used against us.
Yeah, right. So, and we can have an example of that. I think an example that's also ambiguous. So I would like to hear your point on this. So the contact tracing apps that that kind of, a lot of governments said they will create them. Then as most of them realized that low energy Bluetooth is not that easy, then suddenly Google and Apple took to the stage, said we're collaborating, we will change the operating systems. They created the entire libraries, the exposure notification for that. A lot of different projects are running on this library, including the Polish contact tracing app, Protego Safe. So at first, just to give you a brief story, at first our Ministry of Digital Affairs tried to build it on its own, on GitHub. So everything was fully transparent. Then they realized they cannot. So they kind of like scrapped the project, built it once again on GAPLs, as they call it, on GAPL's libraries. Now, not that many people use it. Nobody knows if Google and Apple will, use the library later on. But maybe actually this is something that we should do, but also democratically govern for, another epidemics case. What do you see? Is this some kind of crossroads for such choices?
Well, I should say that I'm not, I'm not an expert on that specific dilemma, I've downloaded the app. I use the Canadian version of it, which I believe uses the Apple and Google APIs, because I believe in governments. So I guess I would be like a social democrat. I believe in those infrastructures, in the same way that I would want people to pay their taxes or take the census or participate in civic life and have that infrastructure. I think it's important. So if I believe those those agencies, and they are transparent and they use the technology in a way that guarantees transparency, then yes, I think that we ought to use them. So yes, but does it bother me that came out of Google and Apple. It does in the sense that I would like to see a future where government does not sort of cede that innovation capacity to private actors, and specifically to Silicon Valley. There's a interview in the film that we did with Bianca Wiley, who is a Toronto-based sort of civic tech pioneer, and as she said, that there's nothing inherently capitalist about computer science or the data literacy, right? It's just that there's been an agenda from Silicon Valley to sort of be like, hey, this stuff's complicated. It's it's techie. We got this, and I think that is a posturing that you have seen in tech that I think needs to evolve. So I do wish that that there was career paths for computer scientists and public technologists who would do that and build that for our governments.
Brett, we're running out of time, so I guess that we can sum this up by saying that the problems are in some ways technological, but to much broader extent also cultural. We just need to start imagining more, talking about those narratives, how this future could look like. Brett, thank you so much for being here with us and for this talk. I thank also you, Anna, for being here with us.
Thanks. I had a good time moderating the chat, so thanks for all the questions, and I hope to see you around for the next days.
Right. So the entire movie, Internet of Everything, directed by Brett Gaylor, is available now online for the next 48 hours. The movie in total is 52 minutes long. That's the attention span that I guess everyone can live with. The movie is available at Ninateka. So from October 18, 9 p.m. to October 20, also 9 p.m. minus 1 minute.
In Warsaw.
That's where I love the set. That looks so cool.
It's
amazing.
amazing.
You guys have pulled it off really well. I mean, I thought it was like going to be dark, and oh, look at it. It's beautiful. Well done. Is that who's in the background? Who's running the camera? Is Kate there?
It's plenty of people, so thanks everyone.
The back office superheroes. Thank you so much, folks.
Thanks to all the superheroes.
Yeah, I'm so impressed. It's been really well produced, and this was really fun. So thank you. And thank you, Anna, for all the invitations, and thank you, Jan, for moderating.
Thank you for joining, and thanks everyone.
Woo!
Have a great day, Brett. Bye.
Yes.